Chandler Smith's future at Joe Gibbs Racing is a little uncertain, and FedEx may be leaving NASCAR in the not-so-distant future. What's going on, guys? It's Daniel, and welcome back to our video. We got some NASCAR and other motorsports stories discussed here today on the channel. Let's go ahead and just show them straight really quickly. We're first going to take a look at a ton of paint schemes that have been revealed over the course of the last couple days. Let's go ahead and just show them straight into them. The first paint scheme we're taking a look at is Cole Custer's 2024 NXT scheme that we'll see this weekend at Kansas Speedway. Scheme's alright in my opinion, looks pretty good. I like the colors on it. I think SHR's had some good looking paint schemes. Definitely looking forward to see this one on the racetrack this weekend at Kansas. The next paint scheme we're taking a look at is AJ Allmendinger's 2024 Morris Shea Bro scheme that we'll see for the first two playoff races in Xfinity. I like the scheme quite a bit. I like the purple. I like the yellow. I think it looks solid. Looking forward to see on the racetrack this weekend and next weekend. The next paint scheme we're taking a look at is Dean Thompson's 2024 Boot campaign scheme that we'll see at Talladega Superspeedway next weekend. I like it a lot. The colors look pretty solid. They do look pretty good. And I'm definitely looking forward to see on the racetrack definitely later this year at Talladega Superspeedway. The next paint scheme we're taking a look at is Bubba Wallace's 2024 Columbia scheme that we'll see this weekend at Kansas Speedway. They tend to run a lot of different Columbia branded paint schemes all throughout the year. I like the yellow, I like the gold. I think this one looks pretty good, and I'm definitely looking forward to see on the racetrack this weekend at Kansas Speedway. The next paint scheme we're taking a look at is Todd Gilliland's 2024 Rasmussen Air scheme that we'll see, I believe, this weekend at Kansas Speedway. I think this one looks pretty good in my opinion. The paint scheme does look pretty solid. I'm definitely looking forward to see on the racetrack this weekend at Kansas Speedway. The next paint scheme we're taking a look at is John Hunter Nemechek's 2024 gear wrench scheme that we'll see next weekend at Talladega Superspeedway. This is very similar to all the gear wrench schemes we've seen with JGR points this year and also with Legacy Motor Club and Xfinity especially. I think this one looks pretty solid and it looks pretty good. Looking forward to see on the racetrack next week at Talladega. And the final paint scheme we're taking a look at is Ty Dillon's 2024 Fit RX scheme that we'll see this weekend at Kansas Speedway. I think this one looks solid in my opinion. I do like the colors. I think Colin can nail this one in the park. It looks pretty good, and I'm definitely looking forward to see on the racetrack this weekend at Kansas Speedway. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Mike Harman Racing. As it was reported by Bob Pockrass yesterday that Mike Harman Racing has officially received the RCR 33 points in the NASCAR Xfinity Series. This, according to Bob, is moving them above the 107 and also the 53 in owner's points as well. And here's some good news as well. The 53 team has withdrawn from the event, so the more owner points in the higher position that Mike Harman Racing can get, the more likely they'll be able to make the field going forward. Let's say that Dawson Cram gets the top 25. That's going to be an extra 15, 16 owners points they could use, which could be really huge for the remainder of this year, considering I don't think the 33 RCR car, which was driven by Kyle Busch earlier this year, I don't think this car is going to be back on the racetrack anymore this season. So I think it's a really good move, in my opinion, to try to pick it up. I think it's really awesome, great to see that they will get the points going forward, which I think is going to help their organization as a whole, and I think it's going to help them be able to get in events going forward. Really awesome stuff, in my honest opinion. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about JJ Yeley. As it was announced on Monday that JJ Yeley will drive the 14 for SS Greenlight Racing this weekend at Kansas Speedway. JJ Yeley's made select starts in the NASCAR Xfinity and Cup Series throughout the 2024 season, but he is not currently full-time at this moment. JD's had some solid runs at SS Greenlight Racing this year. I think he's had a couple top 25s, and I think occasionally a top 20 throughout the year so far. Even though this is not the fastest car, sometimes JJ Yeley can get the best out of equipment, especially. So I think it's a really solid and good opportunity for JJ, and I really hope he can make the best of it. Let's see if JJ can have a solid and good run in that 14 car this weekend at Kansas Speedway. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Stephen Parsons and Chris Osborne. As it was reported by Bob Pockrass yesterday, that Stephen Parsons and Chris Osborne will still remain at the same organizations that they currently work with at this particular moment. Stephen Parsons will still start spotting for Justin Haley this weekend. Stephen's been working with Spire all season. He'll work with Justin Haley starting this week, who transitions over to Spire Motorsports. And Chris Osborne will still be working with Cory LaJoie for the the remainder of this year and potentially 2025, as most likely Cory LaJoie will get behind the wheel of the number 51 car for Rickwell Racing in the 2025 season. Overall, this doesn't surprise or shock me. Some had thought Stephen Parsons was working with Cory LaJoie, but I think Stephen wanted to work with Spire Motorsports because they are paying a lot of money to a lot of people who work at Spire. So I think it's the best move they could have made, in my opinion, and I think it's pretty cool to see that both people will still get to work with their respective organizations for the 2024 season for the remainder of this year. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Gene Waddell. As it was reported by Joseph Shirley from the Toby Christie Network that Gene Waddell has officially become the crew chief for Jimmie Johnson at Legacy Motor Club. We talked about this earlier this year on the channel, that the original crew chief, Jason Burnett, was fired about a month or so ago, and now Jason Burnett is working with Tanner Gray over in the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series. So they're bringing the guy who's basically the technical guy of vehicle performance to work as the crew chief. At this point, when I see Legacy Motor Club, they just need to be consistent and stop hiring people and moving people around. They've been making so many changes and so many moves, and you can't keep doing this for your organization to get better because so much turnover can cause a lot of controversy with your fans especially. So I really don't like changing it up. I get why they're bringing this guy in. I don't think Gene's ever crew chiefed a car in his career. I could be wrong, but I don't remember seeing this name ever crew chief in the Cup Series, the Xfinity Series, or Truck Series. So I'm not really expecting him to do a really solid job with Jimmie Johnson for the remainder of this year. We also don't know how many races Jimmie Johnson's going to be running the remainder of this year. I think he's still got Phoenix on his schedule. I think that's his last scheduled race for this year. But also, of course, he could come back for Jimmie for the Daytona 500. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in regards to what happens for the remainder of the year. But he will be the crew chief for Jimmie Johnson for the remainder of this season at least. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Cory Heim. As it was officially confirmed on Monday that Cory Heim will drive the 26 car for Sam Hunt Racing this weekend at Kansas Speedway. Cory Heim has made select starts in the NASCAR Xfinity Series so far this year for Sam Hunt Racing, and to be real, Cory has been pretty solid in this car this year. He had a chance to win Atlanta Motor Speedway, finishing inside the top 5. He's qualified up front in a lot of these races, and I feel like the 26 team, at least when Cory's behind the wheel, they tend to run pretty solidly. Now, this team also has had some inconsistency, and they've had some mechanical issues throughout this season, but I do think Cory Heim is a pretty solid driver overall as a whole. So I do think this is a really good move for Cory to get some Xfinity Series starts. It's unknown at this point what the future for Cory Heim is in Xfinity. It's rumored he is going to be staying with Tricon Garage in 2025 in the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series, which I don't fully agree with, by the way. I personally think he should move up at this point, but I don't think that's going to happen at the moment. But I think this is nonetheless a really good opportunity for him, and I do think he'll do a pretty solid and good job with the Sam Hunt Racing organization for sure this weekend at Kansas Speedway with the 2016. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Will Courtney. As it was announced yesterday that Will Courtney will officially become the new sporting director at McLaren F1. Will Courtney, for those of you who do not know, has been working as a higher-up at Red Bull for the last year or so, but Red Bull has been losing a lot of their big-name people over the last year. We all know Adrian Newey. He is, of course, going to be going to Aston Martin immediately. Of course, you have Jonathan Wheatley, who I believe is going to another organization to work with. And then, of course, now you have Will Courtney, who is going to McLaren. This is just another big moment for Red Bull especially, and we've seen it with Red Bull in recent weeks. Red Bull is not the dominant car anymore in Formula One. Basically, their dominant car right now is McLaren. Because they've lost so many of their big-name people, the Red Bull cars have really been struggling recently. Even though Max did have a good run this past week in Singapore, finishing in second, you can clearly tell that this team is kind of struggling at this moment. And it definitely is very concerning, especially for Red Bull, to keep losing a lot of people. Now, they're probably going to hire more people to try to make their stuff better. But losing Will Courtney, it's a massive loss for the organization, and it's another big-name person from the Red Bull group that unfortunately is left to move to another organization that is continuing to grow massively. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Ted Golob. As it was reported by Bob Pockers and announced by Ed Carpenter Racing that Ted Golob has officially become a co-owner of Ed Carpenter Racing. Ted Glove owns Heartland Food Products, owns a couple major coffee companies, Java House in particular, and Splenda. Many of you probably know what Splenda and Java House is, which are two of the biggest coffee companies when it comes to top tier coffee. And Ted Glove brings a lot of money as well. Obviously, Ed Carpenter Racing has been struggling quite a bit over the last year or so, and we do know there's some big stuff coming. It was also reported by Bob Pockris as well with this Ted Glove news. At some point later today, they're going to be announcing their 2025 IndyCar lineup. It's rumored that Alexander Rossi more than likely is going to be behind the wheel of one of these seats. It's not confirmed at this moment, but many are beginning to speculate that Alexander Rossi is currently the front runner to get behind the wheel of this seat, the 21 car, since Rinus VeeKay will not be back with the organization. Rinus could be headed to Rahal next year. That certainly is a potential possibility for 2025. But I certainly do think that with the rumors of Alexander Rossi, I think it's very likely that it does end up happening. It's a very interesting move for sure. It's going to be more money coming in for Ed Carpenter Racing as a whole. And I think overall it's a pretty good move for the organization. Have someone from the Ed Carpenter Racing group have a new owner help. And I think it's going to be good that he'll be able to bring some money in and help the organization going forward, in my honest opinion. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Ricky Senhouse Sr. It's been reported by many reporters in the industry that Ricky Senhouse Jr. has finally been reinstated by NASCAR. Ricky Senhouse Sr., for those who don't know, is the father, of course, of Ricky Senhouse Jr. And remember back in May at North Wilkesboro, Kyle Busch and Ricky Senhouse Jr. had gotten into a fight after the NASCAR Cup race. The All-Star race had officially concluded. Kyle Busch was on his way back to the hauler, and Ricky Senhouse Jr. was just sitting there waiting for Kyle Busch. And then you have Ricky Senhouse Sr., who was coming in trying to fight Kyle Busch. NASCAR had suspended Ricky Senhouse Sr. indefinitely for a very long time, and we weren't sure how long it was going to be. Sometimes NASCAR can end these indefinite suspensions really, really quickly. Other times, like this situation, in this case, they can have indefinite suspensions for a very, very long time. I believe the other individual, RJ Otto, has also been reinstated as well, who was part of that fight as well. I think he'd been a jackman for the organization over at JTG Doherty, who we're going to talk about here in just a short little bit. But I think that it's good to see that Ricky Senhouse Sr. is finally going to be back in the sport. I know it's going to be controversial to say that, especially with what happened, but I do think it's good that things are kind of getting back to normal in this situation, and everyone's kind of moved on from the situation, and now we can get back to focusing on what is important, which is the racing. So it's a very interesting move nonetheless for sure, and I think it's good to see that everything's kind of starting to get back to normal there, and good to see that Ricky Senhouse Jr. has officially been reinstated after being gone for a very, very long time. I think it's a good move to happen for sure, in my honest opinion. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about the Bristol Xfinity Series TV ratings. As it was reported by Adam Stern, the CW got 906,000 viewers for its first ever NASCAR race broadcast, the Food City 300 at Bristol, the channel's highest rating in about 8 months since they started going in any sort of programming that the CW has had. That apparently is up from basically what it's been in the past. I think it had like 690,000 a couple years ago, if I remember correctly. But it was reported by Dr. DeAndre that last year's race on USA TV got around 996,000 viewers. But for the first time, and the first time a race happening on a network like the CW having 906,000 viewers, I think is still very, very good and really good for the future of Xfinity. And considering the fact that their number is probably going to go higher as time progresses and goes on, is really good for everybody involved because it basically is on broadcast and everyone will be able to see it. The big issue is that some people were not able to see the broadcast, which was definitely a little bit concerning for sure. And that's something that the CW and NASCAR will have to kind of work on to get out and reach out to all areas. Now, when it comes to the app, the CW app is not available for this season, but it will be coming into play for 2025, considering that NBC are the ones that are producing the broadcast. I think that's a major reason why that they're not going on there, unfortunately. But I think the ratings are very solid for this weekend. I think that almost having 1 million people tune into the first race is pretty good, all things considered. It's not that bad in my opinion. And I think having almost 1 million tune in, if they can find a way to reach out to all the areas and get everybody involved, I think that's going to make a lot of people happy, and I think it'll be good for all parties involved. So I think it's a really good move, in my opinion, nonetheless, and glad to see that the ratings are in a really solid situation for the Xfinity Series. I hope that number can continue going up. Kansas is a bigger area, so more people should be able to tune in, and hopefully they can find a way to reach out to all the areas going into the future, in my honest opinion. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Shane Van Gisbergen. Now, if you were on Twitter yesterday or a couple days ago, Dillon Jr. put out a very interesting post in regards to the 1981 Charlotte 500, the fall race at Charlotte Motor Speedway when it used to be a 500-mile race. And Dillon Jr. basically was talking about the fact that there used to be a lot of practice sessions that took place throughout the week and more practice, which led to most people running up front. Also, of course, only 3 cars finishing on the lead lap, but still had really, really solid and good racing. And Shane Van Gisbergen actually commented on this by basically calling for more practice. He quintessentially said, can we go back to what we used to do back then, please, where we had a ton of practice? Quintessentially what SVG is doing here is he is calling for more practice. I 100% agree with Shane Van Gisbergen here. That we need more practice, especially for some of these drivers that are inexperienced. Right now in the NASCAR Xfinity Series, they really only get 20 minutes of practice, and then basically they go out and qualify. Especially for short tracks, you only get 15 minutes of practice. I feel like that there should be at least 1 or 2 practice sessions. There should be 45 minutes long each, because the more track time you can get on, it creates more, you guessed it, storylines for the weekend. When you don't have as much on-track activity and much on-track time, it doesn't create the storylines that you're really, really looking for. If you give these guys those storylines for people that cover the sport like myself, I think it's going to be making a lot of people a lot happier. And I think in general, if there can be a way to create more storylines, I think that's really good for the sport as a whole. So to me, I agree with this. We need more practice in NASCAR. And he's not the only one saying this. There's a lot of people that have been saying this. Brad Keselowski said, maybe if I'm adding a little more practice. Dale Jr. has called for more practice as well. And I think if you give these guys a lot more practice, I think the racing quality is definitely going to go up for sure. So I think this needs to happen. I really hope it does end up happening. And I do hope we get to see a chance and opportunity for more practice happen in the NASCAR Cup Series, considering, especially in the lower series too. So I think for the younger drivers in particular, it would help drivers, even like Hailie Deegan especially, would have helped her a little bit. But it would help a lot of drivers who are a little inexperienced. I think giving some of them a little more practice would not be a bad thing overall, in my honest opinion. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about the Bristol Cup TV ratings from this past weekend. As it was reported by Adam Stern, the USA got a 0.98 rating and 1.868 million viewers for Saturday night's Bass Pro Shops night race. Now you think that would not be a great number, right? Well, he reports that it was up 10% in rating and 20% in viewership, which last year got a 0.89 rating and only 1.562 million viewers. Now, having under 2 million people tune into a race, not very good. But having an increased rating regardless, that is still a big up, all things considered. I think that number also probably went down a little bit because of the racing product we saw, which we're going to get into near the end of this episode. But I think still having a number up is good, all things considered, even if the race itself just was not that good. I do think that number will continue to increase. You have to also remember, too, you have college football going on during that time. And college football, especially on Saturday nights, considering I think Tennessee was playing around that time as well, you're going to have less people that are going to tune in. And even though the attendance was really good, 120,000 people came out, which is the largest attendance I think Bristol's had maybe since 2008 or 2009, if I'm not mistaken. So it's still really, really good attendance, and I'm glad to see people coming out. And I think the ratings still being up overall is still a very, very positive and good thing for the sport. And I hope it can continue going forward. We do see that TV rating continue to increase so more people can tune in, because the more people tune in, the more likely you're going to have more money coming in for the sport. So overall, I think this is good to see nonetheless, and pretty glad to see the ratings are up. Granted, I know the ratings are not up like I think a lot of people were hoping for them to be, but I do think it's good to see that at least the ratings are up at least slightly, and it's good to see the ratings at least up a little bit for the event, in my honest opinion. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Matt Mills. As it was confirmed yesterday that Matt Mills will be returning to Nice Motorsports in 2025 driving a number 42 truck once again. Matt Mills has been driving full-time with Nice Motorsports in the 2024 season, and unfortunately this year has been a major downward spiral for this 42 team. He's only had a couple top 10s throughout the year, I think 2-3 top 10s in particular, and I think he's only had one top 5 throughout the whole entire season. I think that coming at Charlotte Motor Speedway in the number 42 truck. Look, I like Matt Mills a lot. I think the guy does have a little bit of talent, but I'm going to be real and honest. There's another driver in that organization named Caden Honeycutt, who should be full-time with the organization. But you have to remember, sponsorship and funding matters a lot in the sport. And if you don't bring as much sponsorship and funding as someone like Matt Mills, who does bring funding to the table, you're not going to basically be in the contending as much. That being said, going into 2025, Matt Mills really needs to step it up, and he needs to do a lot better. How he's done this year is not acceptable. Now, to be fair, Nice Motorsports, they've taken major steps backwards. The only truck that's really been super competitive this year has been that 45 truck when Ross has been behind the wheel and when a driver like Caden Honeycutt's been behind the wheel. I feel like the Nice, they've taken steps backwards this year. I don't know what's happened to the team. I think they were getting their stuff from GMS, if I'm not mistaken. And with GMS gone, they've probably been one of the big Pro A teams, and unfortunately, they've taken major steps backwards. Maybe if they can get their program a little bit better, they could be a lot more competitive going forward into the future. It needs to get fixed, in my opinion, because I think Matt does have a lot better talent than what he's shown this year. But again, he has not been really good, and I think he really needs to do a lot better going into the remainder of this year and also going into 2025 as well. I really hope he can step it up and improve his performance, because right now how he's done this year is not acceptable. I hope things can for sure get better with Matt Mills for the remainder of this year and also at the beginning of 2025 as well. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Kyle Larson. Now, we're going to be talking about Kyle Larson here in just a little bit. But we talked about this on the channel, I believe it was on Monday, about the fact that Zach Brown was on the Happy Harvick podcast late last week, and he said they are in talks and conversations in the future about putting Kyle Larson behind the wheel of a Formula One car. But it wasn't really confirmed if it would be an open test or if it would be like a driver swap with one of the drivers currently at McLaren, that being, of course, Lando Norris or Oscar Piastri. Well, Kyle Larson, after dominating at Bristol, was on a Happy Harvick podcast early this week, and Kyle Larson says they would like to maybe do a driver swap with Lando Norris or Oscar Piastri, but he also says he'd rather do an open test on a racetrack with all cars involved to kind of see where he stacks up. I do agree 100%. Now, here's the issue for Kyle Larson. Kyle Larson would need to have a super license, if I'm not mistaken, in order to do an open test or be a test driver for the organization. To get a super license in Formula One, you have to have 40 super license points. Now, personally, if you know my opinion, I am not a big fan of the super license system that Formula One currently has. I think that the Formula One super license system, it shouldn't be catered all the drivers in the lower series, because the drivers in Formula 2, which is the development ladder, get promoted quickly. I think it should be based on talent and based on merit. And the problem is with some of these drivers that are getting into Formula 1 especially, guess what they're bringing? They're bringing paychecks and they're bringing money as well. And the more money you have, the more likely you're going to end up with some of the rides they're getting. That's why some drivers in Formula 1 currently don't have rides going into 2025, because they don't have the money to go for it. And I really hope this does change going forward into the future, because the more money we can give this series, the better, the less money is relied on, the better I think is for racing as a whole. So I hope it does get fixed going into the future and things do change. But again, I would definitely love to see Kyle Larson get the chance and opportunity to drive a McLaren, maybe in the future get to race in a McLaren, but that's probably not going to happen, unfortunately, at least for the near future. But I do hope it can change, so a driver like Kyle Larson could get the chance and opportunity to get behind the wheel of McLaren F1, maybe in the not-so-distant future. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Zero Cows. As it was reported by Joseph Surley from the TobyChristie.com network that Zero Cows' owner, Kevin Cook, is reportedly on his LinkedIn page, is reportedly expected to potentially partner with JTG Doherty Racing for the 2025 season. I've been looking up this company, and this company looks very, very new. I've never heard of this owner, to be honest, but obviously JTG Daugherty Racing, it is no secret that the JTG side of the JTG Daugherty Racing brand is expected to leave at the end of this year. It is heavily rumored that the JTG Daugherty side, well, the JTG side of it, with their Kroger branding, is expected to go over to RFK Racing for the 2025 season, partnering up with Ryan Preece, and they'll go to a third RFK Racing seat, most likely the number 60 car, and considering the fact that Kroger has had a really good working relationship in the past with Ryan Preece, they're expected to work with Ryan Preece for the 2025 season. That means that the Daugherty side of things, which is owned by Gordon Smith, as Gordon Smith is currently being listed as the main owner of the group, meaning that the JTG side more than likely might be gone altogether at this point. That means that they're looking for sponsorship and funding in some sort of capacity. And if this individual is bringing that sponsorship they're looking for, they'll be able to run for the remainder of this year going into next year as well. Because a lot of people they think the future for the Kroger, especially since Kroger has funded that 47 car for so many years at this point. I think that they need to find a way to bring someone in that is going to bring the funding and sponsorship they need in particular. So in general, I think this is a good move, all things considered. Well, I'm not sure if it's a good move, all things considered, because when you see a company that you really haven't seen before, you're kind of a little bit unknown and uncertain on what exactly they're going to end up providing to the table. So it's a very interesting move nonetheless for sure, though, and interesting to see that they're going to be working with JTG Daugherty's Racing Group for next year, and it looks like new ownership is going to be coming together for this upcoming season. And now we're going to head on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Justin Haley once again. Now, yesterday, Spire Motorsports put out their tweet welcoming Justin Haley to the number 7 car for Spire Motorsports for the remainder of this year and going into 2025 as well. Now, at the end of this year, Justin Haley is going to work with the old group, so realistically, Justin Haley should not be expected to go out there and contend for victory in 2024. But remember, going into 2025, Justin Haley is going to be working with Rodney Childers. Having Rodney Childers to work with, I think, is going to be very, very huge for Justin Haley in the 2025 season. Considering the fact that Rodney Childers, when it comes to working with drivers and organizations, he has really helped and built up organizations over time and over the years as well. And I certainly do believe that Justin Haley is a very talented race car driver. We've seen what he's been able to accomplish and do over at Rickwell Racing this year, getting 3 or 4 top 10s, and he's been very consistent at times throughout the year. Yes, he's been outside the top 13 points for pretty much most of this entire season, but I do think he's done a very solid and good job, all things considered, throughout the entire season, and I think it's a really good move overall to see this, that basically we've seen it before where drivers can go to organizations and they get better. We haven't seen Justin Haley in a top-tier ride, which we are going to talk about Spire here in just a little bit, who's in talks and conversations to become a Tier 1 group. We're going to talk about this very, very shortly, but overall, in general, I think this is good to see that he's getting the chance and opportunity, and I do think he will be able to make the best of it going into the remainder of this year, and I think he will do better than Cory. I think he will do better than Cory LaJoie's done behind the wheel, considering the fact that while Cory's talented, Cory is not as good as a driver than Justin Haley, who's also a veteran, experienced driver, who I think will do a pretty good job with this team for the remainder of this year and going into next year as well. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Indycar. As it was finally confirmed on Monday morning, the Indycar has officially announced its charter system that is going to be going in place starting in 2025. There are going to be 25 charters handed out across 10 organizations, and only 27 cars will be allowed to start every single race except the Indianapolis 500. Now, unlike NASCAR's current charter system, where every single race in the Daytona, including the Daytona 500, where if you have a charter, you are locked into the event guaranteed, for the Indianapolis 500, you are not guaranteed to make the event, and teams can run as many open cars as they want to. Now, the most important thing, we do know there's 25 teams that got them. I believe Chip Ganassi got 3, Ray Hall got 3, I think Andretti got 3, Penske also got 3 for next year, Meyer-Shank got 2, Juncos got 2, Ed Carpenter Racing got 2, and a couple other teams also got 2 and 3 as well. And Arrow McLaren, of course, they got 3 as well. Now, again, there are positives to this charter system. One, the Indy 500 locked-in entries not being a thing. I think that's a really good move for IndyCar, all things considered. But I also do see some clauses coming in where eventually the number of field could be reduced down to 25 cars. And I do worry in the future that we are going to see things come negative from this, kind of like NASCAR's current charter system, which has had some negatives come out about it in recent years and recent seasons. So overall, I do think that there are some positives. Not having locked-in spots for the Indy 500 is a really good thing, but that could change going into the future considering it's Roger Penske. We really can't trust what Roger Penske is doing himself. No disrespect to him. We can't really trust everything that Roger is doing at this point. So I do worry that eventually things are going to change, and not for the positive and probably for the worse. So in general, when I think of this move, again, Primo will be the two entries, most likely, most weeks, that will basically not be locked in. So they'll probably be running most of the races, and we're probably not going to see a lot of other open entries run. But if Ganassi wanted to, especially with Logan Sargent testing a car from Irish Shank, we could see him get behind a women IndyCar at some point. I think that could change going in the future. So we'll see what happens in regards to that and see what happens when it comes to locked-in spots for the Indy 500 for the future. But it could happen by 2031, which could be a negative for this charter system, in my honest opinion. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Ty Dillon. As it was confirmed on Monday late afternoon that Ty Dillon will not be driving the 25 truck for the remainder of the 2024 NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series season. Now keep this in mind with Ty Dillon. He has not been fired from Brackwell Racing. He will be a mentor for Dawson Sutton, who will drive the 25 truck for the remainder of the 2024 season. Now, for those who do not know who Dawson Sutton is a son of Curtis Sutton, who is one of the co-owners of Rackley World Racing. Dawson has made a start or two in the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series this year, and his start runs have not been the most impressive throughout the year, but he's been in the second truck, so usually the second truck isn't as good as the first truck. Now, let's be real with Ty Dillon this year. Ty Dillon has struggled this year with Rackley World Racing. He has not ran very, very well and really has struggled for the most part throughout the entire season. At this point last year, Matt DiBenedetto had 2 or 3 top 5s and 12 top 10s. Ty Dillon's only had 2 top 10s so far this year and is barely inside the top 20 in the standings. Matt DiBenedetto made the playoffs in this truck. Matt DiBenedetto isn't the greatest driver in the world, but Matty D is a much better driver than Ty Dillon. Now, keep this in mind for Ty Dillon fans. Dawson Sutton getting mentorship from Ty, not a bad move in my opinion. But here's the other catch of the situation. If you're a Ty Dillon fan, I wouldn't worry completely too much, and here's why. It is heavily rumored right now that Ty Dillon more than likely is going to be headed over to Colleague Racing in the NASCAR Cup Series for 2025. He is heavily rumored to drive the number 31 car for next season. Ty Dillon, of course, bringing a little sponsorship and funding to the table. And, of course, they got Ty Norris who's going into that organization for 2025 to really help build that program up. However, I don't think Ty Dillon is a driver that should personally be being chosen for the seat. I'd like to see someone from the Xfinity Series that actually has talent get behind the wheel of 31 car, and I do think Daniel Hemrick is a better driver than Ty Dillon. But Ty Dillon was rumored to be driving for the team full-time for this season, and obviously that did not end up happening. So they went with someone who brought sponsorship and funding to the table a little bit more, and that, of course, is Ty Dillon. But I'm not really surprised and shocked by this move, all things considered. I do think it's a good move, at least from the sponsorship side of things. But again, Colleague Racing, they've been making some moves that have been questionable in the past, and we'll see if it works out for them going forward. But as of right now, I'm not really sure if it's going to work out for them going forward. But Ty Dillon will be the most likely driver for Colleague Racing in that seat, and be teammates most likely to AJ Allmendinger in 2025, though I do think that Ty most likely will end up struggling. Unlike AJ, I think will run pretty well with the team next season. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Riley Herbst. Now, Riley Herbst was speaking to the media yesterday in regards to the playoffs for 2024. He says he is focused on the 2024 playoffs, trying to run very good. But there has been a lot of talk considering Riley Herbst's future in NASCAR. Now, Riley Herbst did say to the media that he is still not confident in his future for 2025. And he does admit that all this talk about what he's doing next year has been a little bit of a distraction for him. Now, if you've been paying attention, we've talked about this on the channel quite a bit, but it's heavily rumored right now that Riley Herbst is a current lead candidate to join 2311 Racing in 2025 in a third car. We do know already that Tyler Reddick, of course, will be back behind the wheel of the 45 car, and recently Bubba Wallace signed a multi-year contract extension with 2311 Racing. Now, Denny Hamel did confirm to the media this week that 2311 Racing will also still be on the racetrack. But there's been rumors going around that some do believe that 2311 Racing may have backed away from getting a third charter for next season. So they still are expected to get a third charter for Riley Herbst, but rumors have been circulating maybe RFK became the highest bidder to buy one of the Suras Racing charters. Trackhouse already got a charter for Shane Van Gisbergen for next year, and we already know the front row is expanding. Yes, they haven't signed the charter agreement either at this point, but we do think in the future they are going to sign the charter agreement. So Riley Herbst, my question is it because he's the guy that they're choosing, or they got someone else in mind? Some think maybe Cory Heim could be that driver for next year, and I think Cory Heim would be the better option to go with. However, Riley does bring sponsorship. Unfortunately for Cory Heim doesn't really bring the sponsorship funding that Riley Herbst ends up bringing. It's been rumored that Riley Herbst's family, the Herbst brand, who owns the Terrible's gas stations, they're the ones behind getting Riley Herbst behind the wheel of a NASCAR Cup car. Now, do I think Riley is talented? Yes, there's no denying it. I think he is a talented race car driver. However, realistically, he would not be my choice to get behind the wheel of this seat. I would definitely go with someone different, of course, like Cory Heim. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in regards to Riley Herbst's future, whether or not he'll get behind the wheel of this seat for next year. It'll be very interesting to kind of see what happens there. I do think he's still the favorite to get behind the wheel of this seat. Maybe Carlos Gerber will only come out of retirement, but right now I think they most likely Riley Herbst to get the seat. Cory is also expected to run part-time with 2311 Racing next year in the NASCAR Cup Series if they do run a fourth entry in the 2025 season. And now we're going to head jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Spire Motorsports once again. Now, the Door Bumper Clear podcast was talking a little bit about the Justin Haley and Corey LaJoie swap going into next year. And according to what Brett Griffin said on that podcast, he says that Spire Motorsports is in talks with Chevrolet to become a Tier 1 team, quintessentially become a mini Hendrick. This is very interesting to hear. Obviously, Spire Motorsports, they have been spending a lot of money. Remember, they bought Kyle Busch Motorsports off of Kyle Busch, a KBM organization. They have a Truck Series team now, and they expanded to a 3-car team for this year after only being a 1-car team last year. Kyle Busch, of course, working over there as a consultant. They've brought in Rodney Childers for 2025 to be the crew chief of the number 7 car that Justin Haley is going to drive. They're bringing in Justin Haley, who's under contract also with Hendrick Motorsports for the next couple of years. And there's also rumors that Justin potentially could head over and drive for Hendrick Motorsports in the near future. Then, of course, they've got Carson Hocevar, who is a super talented race car driver who's been doing exceptionally well with Spire Motorsports, especially in recent weeks. And then, of course, you have Michael McDowell, who is joining the organization for 2025 for multiple years. And also, of course, they have Travis Peterson coming over for Front Row Motorsports to work with this team next season. This team is making massive and big moves. But I think there's another underlying factor that a lot of people have not been talking about. That is Andretti. Andretti has been heavily rumored to be coming into NASCAR over the last year or so. Now, why do I bring up Andretti? Well, Andretti works with Gamebridge. Gamebridge is owned by Dan Towers. Dan Towers is also a co-owner of Andretti Global in the Indycar program. So he has a lot of work with that team. And we've seen Marco Andretti, who is the son of Michael Andretti, who is the owner, of course, of Andretti Global. He's been also making some starts in the Truck Series with the Gamebridge sponsorship and all those other companies as well. And has made starts back in the day, well, last year with Spire Motorsports. So I do think that's coming into play. If Spire Motorsports does, in fact, become a Tier 1 Chevrolet team, they would go ahead and surpass, of course, basically teams like Trackhouse Racing and Rich Schultz Racing, which Kyle Busch drives for. Some have theorized maybe in the future Kyle Busch, of course, to end back over in one of these groups like Spire Hendrick Motorsports, which I don't know if that's going to happen. But if Spire becomes a Tier 1 organization for 2025, and let's say they become a mini Hendrick, this would be really huge for Spire Motorsports, and they would become leaps and bounds. I think this has been the most interesting team of this year so far They've been making some pretty massive and major moves over there, and I think Spire Motorsports' future is very, very promising right now. There's a lot of good things going on with the team. There's a lot of really good things going on with the organization, and I like what I'm seeing at the moment. Things are going in the right direction. I think things are in really good shape as a whole, and I like what's happening with the sport as this moment for them. I think things are looking really up for them, and I think things are looking really solid, and I think it's really good to see that Spire is expected in the future to potentially become a Chevrolet team, a Tier 1 Chevy team, which I think will be good for everybody overall. In my honest opinion, when it comes to this, I think this is really good to see. They're making some pretty massive moves, and I think there's some more moves that might be coming down the road, considering Gamebridge is buying up a lot of things and making some pretty big moves overall. Really exciting stuff, in my honest opinion. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about the Bristol night race once again. Now, the conversation all around social media, and when it comes to NASCAR media, has been about how the Bristol night race ended up going this weekend. Kyle Larson put up a dominating clinic, leading 462 of 500 laps, which is a record for a race in the night race, but basically the most laps someone has led at the Bristol night race most laps since Bristol, since Cale Yarborough in 1977. But everybody was talking about the racing product. Now, Kyle Larson chimed in on the race and basically the Jeff Gluck poll, which got a 27.2% rating. And Kyle Larson basically said that lead 450 laps, but have 2 overtime finishes, and that rating he guarantees would go up a bit. Now, I do agree with Kyle Larson a little bit, but also do disagree, which we'll get to Kyle Larson's other thread here in just a second. But Kyle Larson is not entirely wrong. He's right in a sense, because basically, if you have a bunch of overtimes and there's a good finish at the end, and it's a close finish, people are probably going to rate this race like 30 or 40%. But a lot of people voted no is because the race itself just was not that good. Now, Eldon Sawyer was on SiriusXM NASCAR radio yesterday, and he says they were extremely baffled by the product that they ended up seeing. And they were completely baffled by what they saw on the racetrack when it comes to Goodyear. They were expecting a high-wear tire race that we saw in the spring at Bristol, and expectations were very, very high for this race. He says he's very disappointed for the fans with the racing product, and quintessentially said it is not acceptable what we saw, and we do have to work to things going forward. Then Auto Racing Analytics, who puts out a lot of really good stuff. I suggest go and check out their page. He basically put out a chart. And you had Kyle Larson's ahead of everybody else. And then you had the 40th one, which is Ryan Preece, Bubba Walsh 23, Chase Elliott 9, Alex Bowman 48. All these guys conglomerated together, and they're basically all going the same speed. Now, Kyle Larson then also came out and wrote a very interesting thread yesterday. And his thread is a lot more in-depth than what he put out on Monday after the Jeff Gluck poll came out. Kyle Larson basically came out and said that everybody's going the same, basically said, have we ever seen a tire wear race like this, or what we saw in the spring? No. Has everyone been able to pass in the past? It's been difficult to pass at Bristol in the past. Yes. Have we seen banger of races at Bristol? Yes. Have we seen snoozers that have been dominated by Kyle Busch's like 300-plus laps at Bristol? Yes. We've seen that in the past. He said the difference is everybody could get a lot closer together because everyone burned their tires up, and we would have more natural cautions because the tires would cord and burn up. He says he doesn't want to see that all the time going forward, but he also would like to see a car that races a lot better. But he also says, and I do agree with him a lot, stop blaming Goodyear. A lot of people on social media and YouTube in particular have been blaming Goodyear. Now, I do think Goodyear has some fault for sure, but I do think Goodyear is not all at fault for a next-gen car that, let's be real and honest, has been completely flawed for a very, very long time. I think the car has a lot of major issues, and we've been putting a lot of expectations on Goodyear to come forward. Now, tires are definitely important, but Kyle Larson's absolutely right on that front. And Kyle Larson then also continued on by saying that unfortunately we need to tamper our expectations. This is a spec race car. That last line is very, very true. This is a spec car. Everybody is getting the same parts. And eventually, and you think it's all going to be good for the sport to grow, to put it back in the driver's hands. Well, when you have a spec car, everybody goes the same speed. Everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody's doing that. You need to be able to find a way to create variables with everybody doing the same thing. And everyone's got SMT data now where you can look at all the data of, let's say, a driver in front of you, which I think you all think is a good thing, right? But it really isn't a good thing. It's not a good thing for everything. If you want racing to be better, you've got to have a way to separate the field, whether that is increased tire wear, whether that is, of course, finding a way to add more horsepower to the next-gen car, which I think at this point NASCAR should try it. We haven't tried to increase horsepower, so we should do that. It's a shame we do have to tamper expectations, but Kyle Larson was not wrong at all about that. I think, unfortunately, with this next-gen car especially, we sadly are going to have to tamper expectations, which does suck, because I don't want to tamper my expectations on a short-track race, but right now, it's just not good in my opinion, and it's definitely very, very concerning. So, sucks to see this nonetheless, if the racing hasn't been good. Bristol was not a good race. I want to move on from it at this point, because we have continued to talk about it time and time again, and I think it's very frustrating that we do have to continue talking about Bristol, which was not a very good race. It was very bad and not a good race, in my honest opinion. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the first of two major stories in today's episode as we're talking about FedEx. As it was reported by Adam Stern last night that FedEx is expected to continue reducing its sponsorship presence with JGR after the season and could conclude the long-time deal altogether with Joe Gibbs Racing. This could also confirm that FedEx may end up leaving NASCAR altogether. This is absolutely huge if this is true that FedEx is leaving, because FedEx has been part of Joe Gibbs Racing, I believe, since the late 2004 going into the 2005 season. They originally started working with a driver like Jason Leffler in 2005, and then eventually they had a couple of drivers come in and drive the number 11 car at the end of the season before eventually settling on Denny Hamlin. This has been one of the long-time partnerships that we have seen in NASCAR for many, many years. And this would be another major loss for NASCAR if FedEx is going to leave, because FedEx has been part of NASCAR, like I said, for over 2 decades at this point and at this moment. And losing another big sponsorship, not only them, but for Joe Gibbs Racing as well. You think about M&M's and the Mars Company. The Mars Group have been working in NASCAR for over 30 years at a time, since like the beginning of the 1990s when Snickers was around, and when M&M's left Joe Gibbs Racing in the late 2000s especially, actually about a couple years ago, guess what happened? Kyle Busch ended up leaving the organization and went over to Richard Childress Racing, though Kyle has said if JGR wanted to ever call him back to bring an organization, they could definitely do that in the future. But losing a company like FedEx would just be another big loss for NASCAR. You think about all these companies that have left NASCAR, that were part of NASCAR for a long time. PepsiCo, for the most part, granted they did sponsor Daniel Hemrick with Doritos and Mountain Dew, but they were a full season sponsor. Now they're like a one-off sponsor from time to time. Other companies, of course, like the Mars Group and the Mars Group, like Snickers and M&M's. You think about Lowe's. You think about Home Depot. You think about all these other companies, like you said Mountain Dew and Diet Pepsi and all these major brands that have left the sport over time. Red Bull, in a sense, when it comes to sponsoring just majorly altogether. Yes, they have entitlement deals with Connor Zilisch and Shane Van Gisbergen, but we've seen a lot of major sponsors leave over the last few years, and a lot of companies have been leaving because the economy is not as good currently at the moment. And of course, you think about Hooters recently, who's been in a lawsuit with Hendrick Motorsports because they weren't paying Hendrick. That's another major company that's left. You got to think about Burger King, Subway, who hasn't sponsored much in recent years. Other companies coming into play that have been leaving. And some other companies have also been talking about leaving as well. Unfortunately, things are going to continue to be like this over time. And also, when you have new CEOs and ownership come into play, that can change a lot of things up. Joe Gibbs used to be really good friends with the old CEO of the group, but FedEx has been backing off of sports altogether as a whole. They actually were supposed to sponsor the new Washington Commanders place, but basically they've backed off that in the last year or so, and they got a new name to my understanding. So I think FedEx in general, they're reducing their sports presence, which would be very, very huge because FedEx, like I said, has had a loyal sponsorship in NASCAR for years, but they've been backing off with Joe Gibbs Racing. So what does this mean for a driver like Denny Hamlin? Honestly, I don't even think this is going to impact Denny Hamlin like it impacted Kyle Busch. Denny Hamlin's been sponsored by companies like Interstate Batteries and Mavis Tires and Brakes, and all these other big companies have been working with Denny Hamlin in sports clips as well. They've been working with Denny Hamlin. So I think unlike Kyle Busch's situation, I don't think this affects Denny Hamlin. Now, I do think in the next couple of years, Denny Hamlin most likely will end up retiring just because of age, not because of sponsorship issues, because Denny Hamlin isn't going to have trouble finding sponsorship. But I think this is a huge story nonetheless if FedEx does leave NASCAR altogether and Joe Gibbs Racing, considering the long-term partnership it's had in NASCAR for many, many years. It's been around for 20. Also, recently, Geico announced they're going to be leaving as entitlement sponsor. I don't think they're going to be part of NASCAR altogether as a whole going into next year. So we're just continuing to lose a lot of these big sponsors and a lot of these major and massive brands. If FedEx is truly leaving the sport, it really is going to be sad. Now, I do think they'll be around in some sort of capacity, maybe for 2025, but I think at least right now, there's definitely some questions about FedEx's future, and I'm not sure what it means for the future, but right now, it sounds like FedEx could have one foot out the door currently at the moment, which wouldn't be good in my opinion for the sport. If a company like FedEx, which has been a big brand in NASCAR for many years, it would suck to see a company like FedEx leave the sport altogether. In my honest opinion, it would definitely suck to see, and I really hope FedEx does stick around, but if they do end up leaving, it is what it is, to be honest with you. And now we're going to go ahead and jump on to the final major story of today's episode as we're talking about Chandler Smith. Now, yesterday during NASCAR Media Bullpen, you had Chandler Smith being interviewed about the playoffs, and someone in the media center had asked questions of Chandler Smith surrounding his future at Joe Gibbs Racing. Chandler did say he's not really focused on that currently at the moment, and he'll figure that stuff out at the end of this year. Now, why am I talking about Chandler Smith and his future at Joe Gibbs Racing? Well, there's been a lot of chatter in the last couple months that Chandler Smith may not be returning to Joe Gibbs Racing in 2025. It's expected, of course, that Brandon Jones will return to Joe Gibbs Racing next year. The number has not been confirmed at this moment, but Brandon Jones, of course, will be back with Joe Gibbs Racing in the 2025 season, and it's heavily rumored that William Swalch and Taylor Gray are most likely moving out to the NASCAR Xfinity Series full-time. William Swalch is going to make his NASCAR Xfinity Series debut in a couple weekends at Homestead, and it's expected to run full-time from that point on going forward. And then the number 19 car, and then of course you have Taylor Gray, who's made select starts in the NASCAR Xfinity Series this year for Joe Gibbs Racing. He's bringing a little bit of sponsorship and funding to the table, and of course Joe Gibbs really likes him, and they're trying to move him up through the ladder currently at this particular moment, which would mean Chandler Smith's future would definitely be majorly in question. Now, in recent weeks, there have been reports suggesting that Chandler Smith could be a front runner to join Front Row Motorsports in the NASCAR Cup Series next year. However, that is starting to sound less likely, as it's expected that Zane Smith is going to get the third front row seat for 2025. Zane Smith has worked with Front Row in the past. He, of course, won the Truck Series Championship for them in 2022. And when he left the organization, a lot of people at Front Row, from what I have heard, said they really had no issues with Zane Smith, even though there were some rumors coming out, mostly from Kevin Harman, who, of course, had drivers part of his brand. They're still looking for rides going into next year. So that's why I think he was looking to put someone like Riley Herbst in there. Now, what happens to Chandler Smith if he doesn't go to Front Row or go back to Joe Gibbs Racing? At this point, I really don't know what happens to Chandler Smith. The rides are filling up very, very quickly. On the Cup side of things, you do have a Rick Ware car that could be available. They're likely going to run an open car next year, Rick Ware Racing, but I don't think Chandler Smith wants to go to a mid-pack team. You do, of course, have some other organizations like the 31 car in Cup, but that 31 car will be most likely driven by Dillon. Again, 2311 could also be an option, but I think that Riley, unless he goes there next year potentially, I think most likely Riley Herbst is going to get that seat. So then you got to look at the Xfinity Series. Junior Motorsports, they're pretty much set for next year at this point. Connor Zilisch is going to be in the 88 next year. Sammy Smith and Justin Allgaier are confirmed to be back for 2025. And then, of course, you do have Carson Quaffle, who most likely will be full-time with that team next year. And then you got Haas Factory Team. they're set for next year. Sheldon Creed's going to be in the 00. Sam Mayer is going to be in the 41. There was talk of Haley Dean going over there, but that's not happening next year at this point. You've, of course, got a team like Colleague Racing. They're set for next year at this point. The 10 driven by Daniel Dye. Josh Williams is back in the 11. And, of course, you do have Christian Eckes going into 16. So your options are, and of course you have RCR that Austin Hill is set, and Jess Love is also, from what I understand, set for next season as well. So the options are starting to become very limited for Chandler Smith. There are some truck options that are available for next year. The 19 truck for McIntyre Hilgeman is expected to be available next year, unless a driver like Daniel Hamrick ends up going there next year potentially. So the options are starting to become a little bit more limited for Chandler Smith going into 2025. I think that he was the original favorite to drive the 19 car if Martin Truex Jr. retired, but when SHR lost a lot of their talent and when SHR closed down, a lot of things changed behind the scenes, and I think that's why Chandler Smith's future is certainly in question. Now, could Chandler Smith perhaps stay in Xfinity, go to Sam Hunt Racing, maybe take a little bit of a downgrade perhaps, and go to Sam Hunt Racing? That could certainly be an option. I still think he would do a solid job, and I don't think Sam Hunt Racing is a massive downgrade from Joe Gibbs Racing, but it's a little bit of a downgrade, so that could certainly be a possibility for next year as well. At this point, though, I really don't know what this means for Chandler Smith. Chandler Smith is a driver that I feel like has a lot of potential and a lot of talent. And keep this in mind, Chandler Smith is only 22 years old. He is super young. He's got so much potential, and I do think in the future he could be a NASCAR Cup Series champion one day. I go back to Richmond a couple of years ago when he made his Cup debut last year, and he finished in the top 20. So Chandler Smith does have a lot of potential, and I think he is a good driver in my opinion. The problem is that we're so late into the year, and a lot of rides are filling up quickly. Most of the good rides are set for next year. Even some of the big mid-tier rides, like the big machine car that Nick Sanchez is going to drive, that's been set for next year. And Truck Series is starting to fill up. Lane Riggs is going to be back with Front Row. Matt Mills confirmed to 42. We talked about it earlier. There's not as many really good options out there available at the moment, and I just don't know what this means for Chandler Smith. I still think Chandler Smith most likely will find a ride for next year, but it's unknown what's going to happen at this point. I really hope he can find a ride for 2025. I hope he can stay at JGR, but it doesn't sound very likely he's going to stay at JGR unless they can find a way to figure out what they're doing for 25. But he needs to be looking for his options for next year because we're getting late in the year, and rides are going to continue to fill up really quickly. And as weeks progress, most rides will be filled up for the 2025 season. So, that is going to be our today's NASCAR news and motorsports news video. I want to thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, notifications on, so if I win a video, it does go live on my channel. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and support me on Patreon as well. Let's go below that and comment your thoughts below on today's episode. If you think Chandler Smith's going to leave Joe Gibbs Racing, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And what do you think the future of FedEx is? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Later today on the channel, we'll have NASCAR Xfinity Series race picks for this weekend at Kansas Speedway. If any major news breaks throughout the week, we'll discuss it here on the channel. Tomorrow on the channel, we'll see Cup race picks for the Hollywood Casino 400. And you also will see the paint skin video as well. Then on Friday, we'll have a NASCAR news video, most likely, along, of course, with the Truck Series race review. Saturday, you're going to see the NASCAR Xfinity review, reactions to Cup qualifying, and also you're going to see an SVG video dropping. And then on Sunday, you'll have the NASCAR Cup review along with the starting lineup video, and most likely on Monday, you'll have a NASCAR news video. Got a lot of great content dropping that I cannot wait for you guys to check out. So anyways, like I said, I want to thank you guys for watching today's episode, and I'll see you guys next time for more great, awesome NASCAR content and other motorsports content on the channel like this. Take care, everybody.